Hello and welcome back to ThoughtBat. Today's video is one I'm very excited to release actually, just for the outlandish title and concept. Today I'll be discussing anarcho-capitalism and the controversial case that anarcho-capitalism may in fact be an anti-capitalist ideology, which merely suffers from poor labelling. Before we begin, a video giving such charitability to this theory requires me to stress that I am indeed not an ANCAP, despite the argument I will be making in this video, and I will go through the material differences between ANCAP theory and my own to justify my ongoing distancing of myself from the anarcho-capitalist school, despite entertaining the idea that their theory is an anti-capitalist ideology. I will start with a discussion on the meaning of the word capitalism and argue why I think my definition is more accurate than some others. I will then explain why I think capitalism may be a poor hyphenation to use when referring to anarcho-capitalism after giving consideration to ANCAP theory as synthesized by Murray Rothbard, before finally giving some constructive criticism to our newfound allies of the anti-capitalist movement. With all that said, let's begin. Many anarchists who regard themselves as being on the left wing of the political scale will argue that anarcho-capitalism is necessarily not a school of anarchism, as it is a school of capitalist apologetics.
Basically advocating, although they don't know it, is pure corporate tyranny, just the exact opposite of liberty.
Associating the term capitalism with the top-down business structures which dominate today's market economies, left-wing anarchists include the term capitalism in their extensive list of unjust hierarchies which they seek to abolish in order to bring about a genuinely free society. But, it seems to me, the disagreement between ANCAPs and left anarchists begins with the very definition of the term capitalism. It's observable that the meaning of capitalism has become a much broader and variable term since the early 20th century than today's socialists would like to accept. The intersubjective nature of language is frustrating, insomuch as it means that definitions of terms are not concrete and therefore unlikely to be universal. The meanings of words are going to differ from person to person, text to text, and context to context, and the term capitalism is no different. To help us make sense of this semantic problem, Gary Chartier has identified 3 definitions of capitalism in his important essay titled Advocates of Free Markets Should Embrace Anti-Capitalism. The first of which is what I've seen used by contemporary libertarian movements in both the UK and the USA, including anarcho-capitalists, and that is an economic system which features property rights and voluntary exchanges of goods and services. That's capitalism 1. The second definition identified by Chartier is an economic system which features a symbiotic relationship between big business and government, which is a definition of capitalism given by early Tuckerite libertarians and individualist anarchists. Capitalism 2 is often referred to by ANCAPs and libertarians as corporatism. And finally, capitalism 3 will be more familiar to the Marxian socialists and sociologists in my audience, which is noted to be rule of workplaces, society and, if there is one, the state, by capitalists, and that is a relatively small number of people who control investable wealth and the means of production. Before I begin my discussion of these definitions, it would be helpful to give my own position. I'm a mutualist, which means I advocate a stateless, free market economy based on mutual banking and usufruct property rights. Under such a model, absentee property rights will be abolished and production will be majoritively carried out by worker-owned cooperatives and independent traders with some room for consumer ownership over certain infrastructure and natural monopolies such as roads and water supplies. Landlordism will be abolished and housing cooperatives will fill the gap in the market for an affordable means of paying off construction and maintenance costs. Intellectual property will also be abolished and consequently, patent monopolies will simply cease to exist. Mutual banks will be not-for-profit, owned by their members and charge minimal interest rates to pay off admin fees to develop a reserve fund to be put back into investments. People will have the freedom to choose which currencies they are to invest in and trade with, and my analysis of property rights can be found in my video titled Why is Property? A Gaping Hole in Anarchist Theory. So, with that brief description of mutualism in mind, I hope it's evident that the economic system which I envision is radically different to the one we live in today, and is not likely to spring to mind when we hear the term capitalism. The problem is that my proposed system actually fits the definition of capitalism 1, despite myself identifying very strongly with the anti-capitalist movement. Mutualism involves property rights, albeit usufruct only, and a medium for voluntarily exchanging goods and services. The fact 2 radically different and even contradicting systems may be described as capitalism would hopefully be enough evidence to dismiss capitalism 1. we on the left of market anarchism are not simply referring to property rights and voluntary exchange when we say we'd like to see capitalism done away with. Capitalism 2 and 3 seem to be interdependent. It would appear that Capitalism 2 would surely lead to elements of Capitalism 3, especially dominance by capitalists over workplace and society. But there is an important distinction between the two. Capitalism 2 implies that the state is an organisation independent from big business and is more of a partner to corporate oligarchs, whereas Capitalism 3 implies that the state is necessarily under the control of capitalists. We've heard the term dictatorship of the bourgeoisie from Marxists in reference to the liberal state. However, to imply that capitalists dominate the state would be to completely ignore the very evident power struggle which exists between the state and big business, even if business owners do indeed exist as members of the state. Whilst the relationship between capitalists and the states remains symbiotic, as big business is afforded particular economic privileges in order to maintain their dominant position in the market, such as corporate welfare, enforcement of property rights, arbitrary licensing requirements, patent laws, etc., all to maintain a stable source of tax revenues for the state, big business also concedes certain powers to the state in the form of labour laws, environmental regulations, and perhaps most importantly to the state, the tax revenue as mentioned earlier. These limitations on capitalist power simply would not exist if the lawmakers were dominated by owners of capital. Rather, the wealthy merely have a strong advantage in electoral politics, as they have more funds to donate to their preferred electoral candidates and greater access to platforms and mainstream media outlets. Therefore, my own definition of capitalism includes a synthesis of elements between Capitalism 2 and 3. When I talk about capitalism, I'm talking about a plutocratic oligarchy which engages in a symbiotic relationship with the state. This corporate hierarchy is dependent on the enforcement of absentee property, and so therefore capitalism may be defined as an economic system by which commerce occurs primarily through the medium of absentee-owned property, within which the owners of capital necessarily engage in a competitive yet mutually beneficial relationship with the state, if there is one. So now that semantic mess is hopefully cleared up, and my usage of the term capitalism is shown to be a better definition than the others, and my definition is understood to be something proponents of anarchist principles would want nothing to do with, we can now go on to see how anarcho-capitalist theory actually comes off as anti-capitalist. As the 20th century progressed, there became an observable split in anarcho-capitalist thought. Brad Spangler's 2006 essay, Market Anarchism as Stigmergic Socialism, Spangler notes that there became two sharply divided strains of thought based on the rationale for a market anarchist society. On the one hand, there was the Rothbardian argument, which was rooted in the theory of natural rights, and on the other, there was the utilitarian case as provided by David Friedman, who is of course the son of Milton Friedman, who is apparently not the same man as Murray Rothbard. Wait, well who the hell is that then? Well, in any case, Rothbardian philosophy is simply taking the Lockean justification for the right to use property to its logical conclusion, whereas Friedmanite ancapism simply focuses on the utility which will be attained as a consequence from the establishment of an anarcho-capitalist economy. In the essay, Spangler recalls a hypothetical scenario given to ANCAPs. It involved the government, which was buckling to libertarian pressure, deciding to sell off its assets to become the private property of its political leaders. So instead of imposing tax, the new proprietors, who happen to be the exact same people who used to control the government, charge rent. They enforce rules instead of laws, which just so happen to be exact replicas of the laws of old, and they remind their tenants, that they are free to leave the premises so long as they apply for clearance to do so. Spangler notes that all anarcho-capitalists would clearly object to such an arrangement and will continue to fight for the liberty from this government in disguise. However, only the Rothbardians, and not the Friedmanites, have logical and legitimate reason to do so, because of the Rothbardian theory of just property titles, which utilitarian ethics declines to concern itself with, due to its consequentialist nature. Therefore, we can reasonably dismiss David Friedman's dysfunctional defence of ANCAP economics in its entirety. According to the Rothbardians, proprietorship of an unowned object is validated through the enactment of physical labour upon the object. As each person necessarily owns their body, they consequently own their labour and consequently the product of their labour. Rothbardians recognise that the state accumulates its wealth and assets through the use of violence, compulsion and theft, and so the property that is owned by the state is actually not there to transfer to private empires, or even sell off to the highest bidder. In Rothbard's essay titled Confiscation and the Homestead Principle, Rothbard answers directly the problem of who is entitled to own state assets if not the state. He says, "This question has been essentially answered by the exciting developments of Tito's Yugoslavia. Since 1952, Yugoslavia has been desocializing at a remarkable rate. The principle the Yugoslavs have used is the libertarian homesteading one. The state owns factories to the workers that work in them. The nationalised plants in the public sector have all been transferred in virtual ownership to the specific workers who work in the particular plants, thus making them producers' co-ops and moving rapidly in the direction of individual shares of virtual ownership to the individual worker. What other practicable route towards destatization could there be? The principle in the communist country should be land to the peasants and the factories to the workers, thereby getting the property out of the hands of the state and into private homesteading hands. Maybe Rothbard was unaware of the specifics of how property laws worked in Yugoslavia. The Yugoslav state still owned the capital which the workers democratically managed, but that is immaterial to the answer given by Rothbard. Rothbard believed that, because they were the ones working on the capital, which was owned without legitimacy by the state, they were the rightful joint owners. But Rothbard didn't stop there. The same principle applies to nominally private property, which comes from the state as a result of zealous lobbying on behalf of the recipient. Columbia University, for example, which receives nearly 2/3 of its income from government, is only a private college in the most ironic sense. It deserves a similar fate of virtuous homesteading confiscation. But if Columbia University, what of General Dynamics? What of the myriad of corporations which are integral parts of the military-industrial complex, which not only get over half or sometimes virtually all of their revenue from the government, but also participate in mass murder? What are their credentials to private property? Surely less than zero. As eager lobbyists for these contracts and subsidies as co-founders of the garrison state, they deserve confiscation and reversion of their property to the genuine private sector as rapidly as possible. In the essay, Rothbard also considers the possibility of consumers having a claim to the property because, as taxpayers, they were the ones who had money stolen from them in order for the state's physical assets to exist. The essay is in the description for you to explore at your own will. Another consideration would be how megacorporations benefit from arbitrary patenting laws, which, to be fair, are actually still, to this day, debated amongst Rothbardians. Admittedly, Rothbard was not against copyright laws like some ANCAP such as Karl Hess, but it was against patenting laws, so the ANCAP position on that is blurry. But in any case, I think it is clear that Rothbardian property ethics do everything but prop up what we on the left would refer to as capitalism. Corporate assets will be expropriated as courtesy of their relationship with the state, and those assets will be redistributed amongst their employees and or consumers. And this mass cooperativization would lead to the displacement of absentee ownership as the primary medium of commerce. The resultant economy will, by our definition, not be a capitalist one. With all that being said, and as exciting as it is to jump in headfirst and call ANCAPs anti-caps, fellow socialists even, there is still a major difference between mutualism and Rothbardian market anarchism, and that is the theory of property which leads the latter to its anti-capitalist conclusions. Brad Spangler was actually incorrect to suggest in his essay that both of our schools have the same labour-based property ethics, and that we only disagreed on other theories of value. Mutualist property norms are not at all labour-based, and P.J. Proudhon dedicated an entire chapter in his work, What is Property?, to critiquing the concept that property is the daughter of labour. The father of anarchism notes that the proprietor was never forced to enact the labour upon any object by any other person, and so the proprietor has no right to forcibly alienate the rest of the human race from each and every object that they have ever laboured to create, develop or maintain. Proudhon then goes on to explain how the ability to alienate property from its users, and thus the labour of other users, then infringes on their natural rights of liberty and equality. Workers who do not own the labour are no longer free or sovereign, and the fact one person owns the labour of everyone else in the company, by virtue of the original labour, means that there is no longer equality. It should be noted that property isn't just a case of access and consumption, but also of authority. If property was justified by labour, then this allows proprietors access to authority simply by virtue of working on unowned property, which doesn't seem to be a reasonable means of distributing power. Additionally, and as noted in my video covering the topic of property, you must first occupy land and possess resources before you can mix your labour with any of it. Therefore, occupancy, and not labour, is indeed the basis for ownership. If you're interested in a deeper dive into this topic, then the video is in the description. So, to conclude, my genuine answer to the question of whether anarcho-capitalism is anti-capitalist or not is, perhaps boringly, yes kinda and no not really. Yes, in regards to the fact that its application will see the displacement of capitalist business models as a primary medium of production and commerce, but not really because it provides no critical analysis of property relations as a distribution of power, as well as a solution to the problem of access and consumption in a world with finite resources. It is also possible, perhaps even probable, that capitalist firms will regain their dominant presence in a freed Rothbardian market economy and effectively reproduce the plutocratic oligarchy which commands our economy today. Perhaps this is an area for further thinking. But, in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it thought-provoking. If so, give it a like, and if you haven't, subscribe to the channel. If you thought I was talking complete nonsense, then feel free to tell me about it in the comments, and I will respond to your criticisms as I usually do. And also don't forget you can follow me on Twitter, and join the Batcave Discord server, where I discuss these ideas in an informal manner with viewers. With all that being said, I'm off. I'll see you later.